I'll ask the clerk to read and record the verdict.
In the Superior Court of the State of Arizona in and for the County of Maricopa, State of Arizona versus Lori Daybell, CR 2021-001704-001, verdict count 1. We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action, upon our oaths, do find the defendant, Lori Daybell, as to the crime of count 1, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder occurring on or about July 11, 2019, guilty.
Hey everyone, welcome to Inside the Courtroom. I apologize, it sounds like we might have a hard time hearing Andrea here, but of course what you just heard inside the courtroom was Lori Vallow Daybell being found guilty. This is in her murder conspiracy case here in Arizona. Of course, we already know she's been convicted of killing her children in Idaho, as well as her role in the death of Tammy Daybell, her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife. So a big day in court here. And what we understand is that, I was in the courtroom. We were waiting for a long time to see if this is something, if we were going to get a verdict today. We expected it might be coming, but really it was that moment there. And once, we were in the courtroom, it really came quickly. So what I can say being in there is that, again, we were waiting all day, media, people in there, we were waiting for this. And Andrea, are you able to hear me now? I want to bring you in if we can.
Yes. I had things to say and then it didn't go anywhere, right? I apologize
for the technical difficulties, but I was just you'd missed just a moment. And I wanted to let you know that, we just brought them in the courtroom where she was, found guilty. I was explaining that it almost felt like, before, the court employee read that verdict, it was like a collective, inhale and then kind of this exhale once they said guilty. And some of the people in the courtroom, included Charles Vallow's siblings, other family members. And it was just this really big moment. And what I noticed from Lori Vallow Daybell is she just sat there. There wasn't a moment of moving her head, shaking her head, anything. So it was pretty surreal, especially all this time coming, not just throughout the course of this trial, but it's been 6 years since Charles Vallow was shot and killed.
Yeah. And no doubt people are watching for that reaction. That's human nature. We want to see kind of, how does she respond? And we've seen that before, of course, in her previous trial. We watched her kind of respond, shaking the head. And I think even family members, I know that you talked to them outside the courtroom afterwards. I think they were also watching for that as well. That tension you talk about, if you think about it, they've been waiting, right? They've been sitting and waiting. Now, this jury took, just under 3 hours to reach their decision. Of course, it's a unanimous decision. That's what's required in order for that verdict to be read. And so we're waiting for that. Of course, each moment they're certainly anticipating. And then once we knew the verdict was in, we still had another 30 to 45 minutes. I think it was about 45 minutes or so after they learned about the verdict until it was read in order to get everyone in place, to get the jury back in, to get prosecutors, defense team back in. And so, of course, that tension just building. And so I'm sure you felt that. I'm sure it was palpable in the courtroom.
Oh, yes, you can tell. And again, it was a lot of hurry up and wait throughout the day today. And we were all just sitting there. And then as soon as someone you see someone kind of like, get their phone. And we're all like, get your phone. And we were, tweeting out, we're expecting this. We know we're hearing this. And then it was a matter of getting inside the courtroom today. So it was really, a big moment. I'm glad we could be there to witness this. That's what we do as journalists. And, you mentioned the family, certainly an emotional, moment for them as well. And this case, again, just before we get to some of that family sound, and I want to let people know we heard from some jurors after too. I know the big question in all of this was, did they know about Lori's past? So we'll get to them in just a little bit. But I want to start by saying Charles Vallow was killed in 2019. He was shot and killed by Lori's brother, Alex Cox. And throughout this trial, Lori said, no, this was self-defense. She, her prior convictions did not come up in this case. And it was a very narrowly focused case on Charles Vallow's shooting. Of course, Lori's brother, Alex Cox, cannot be charged because he also died in 2019 from natural causes, according to the medical examiner here in Arizona. But this has been a long time coming because everything had to play out in Idaho before we could move forward with these cases here. So I think this was, again, a long time coming, especially for some of the siblings of Charles Vallow, who have been with this from the beginning.
And they've not only been there as witnesses and, essentially victims advocates, because, especially his sister Kay, very connected to the trials here in Idaho, those previous convictions, her grandson, one of the people that was at the heart of this. And of course, we know she was convicted, Lori Vallow Daybell, convicted of killing JJ, of conspiring and helping with that plan. And so certainly, an emotional perspective there, but also as a witness, she has been called and asked to provide some key information, key evidence, because she's connected to that life insurance policy. And she has had a front row seat, of course, to that relationship between Lori and Charles. And so such an interesting dynamic, playing a key role in this, but also being there just to watch kind of as a spectator, somebody who is very emotionally invested in multiple of Lori's victims.
Absolutely. And, we were able to catch up with her outside the courtroom, and she described this as like walking through the pits of hell for several years. And I don't blame her. I understand maybe any emotion she would have at this point. But like you said, Andrea, she really was the forefront of, kind of ringing the bell, sounding the alarm when Lori's children first went missing in 2019. And that, we know, was kind of a key moment that really shined a spotlight on this case and all the tangents it would go on. And she's Charles Vallow's sister, and she was shocked that this happened. And it was just the beginning of her life changing as she knew it. So I want to get to some of their sound because it's super important to hear from them. And we're so grateful that they take the time to speak about this. But I was able to ask her and, Charles's brother, who was also there, what they would say to Lori if they could say something. Take a listen. I'm wondering if there's anything you'd say to Lori at this point.
We got you. And you're not the smartest person in the room, and now it's time for you just to hide away. And well, after Brandon's trial, but you can just hide away, and everybody's going to forget about you. We'll be on our way through our life, and she'll be rotting in prison where she deserves to be.
And like Charles always used to say, love always wins.
Yeah.
So.
And thank you for saying that. Yeah, love always wins was Charles's thing, and so it does.
Right. You see there two of Charles Vallow's siblings, his brother, his sister. I believe another sister was there, kind of in the background there, but also, coming together. Again, we've talked about how this family has united, and multiple families have joined together, really, in this tragedy, and have come together and really supported each other through it. And she mentioned Brandon's trial. We'll talk about what's next. That is next. And she said, I'll be here. They are not backing down. They are going to see this through for all of Lori Vallow Daybell's trials.
Yeah, absolutely. And, something that stood out to me was that she said, we certainly lost family throughout this process, but we've also gained a family in all of the supporters and all of the other surviving victims, because they really have banded together. And something she said during, her remarks outside the courthouse was that Rob Wood, the prosecutor in Idaho, texted her today, congratulations. Like, if that doesn't say how interconnected all of this has been and just how much support the community in Idaho has given to this family, I think that really says it all.
Well, and she has spoken many times about, really not wanting Charles to be the forgotten victim. And I think that it's easy to see why he wasn't the center, of course, of the trials here in Idaho. So that wasn't her finding fault, but just simply saying that we can't forget that there is another victim here. And of course, somebody very, very close to her. And so I think this is validation. I think vindication. I think you can see that. I think her brother talked about, or Charles Vallow's brother talked about, elation, feeling elation. And that's difficult, I know, for people. And I think they've talked about this in the tragedy, there is, a sense of relief because there is one more step, I think. And like I said, that's that vindication, I think, that they have been very obvious about feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. And, they also talked about having to sit through this all the time. I just want to say it's, Lori Vallow Daybell didn't have to move forward with this case. Of course, that's her right. She didn't have to, defend herself. She could have pled guilty. She could have had attorneys. I think her defending herself added an extra layer of, insult to injury, so to speak, because she did have the opportunity to cross-examine Kay Woodcock. And at times it was super tense. She, would say, well, you didn't know he died. And she's like, well, you didn't tell me. There were so many factors there that I think the jury got to see. And, they were asked, the jurors, some of the jurors, we'll get to them in just a moment, but what we learned throughout the course of these remarks is that some of the jurors really, Kay's testimony in this really stood out to them, just how she spoke of her brother, how she spoke of the declining relationship with Lori Vallow Daybell, and, just the nature of how this evolved in a way it didn't have to. None of this had to happen. So it was just interesting, and it's striking to me that this family has had to sit through trial after trial after trial and be presented with this evidence. There's a lot of graphic evidence. We had to look at, or the jury, I say we in the courtroom, and the jurors had to look at autopsy photos. There's a lot of elements to this case that are dark and disturbing. There are dark religious beliefs that come up in this case, and it's confusing and sad and highly emotional. So it's such a charged position to be in. And I really applaud them for, continuing to be the face of survivors in this case.
Oh, yeah. And I think we talked about it the day that Kay took the stand. I mean, I think her testimony is just as the jury said, and that's interesting to hear them, because you always wonder what they think and how they're interpreting what we're seeing. We certainly have bias because we have covered this trial, bias meaning we have insight that they don't have. So we have access to information about her, a lot more information about her. We've seen her speak on multiple occasions. And I think we talked that night about, just her nature, her composure. She is direct, but yet very personable. I think that does speak volumes to, she says love wins. And she was very clear on the stand about, I loved Lori. We were close. And so I think that also speaks to that heartbreak and just how terrible this must have felt. And I can't help but think that you're sitting in that courtroom thinking, just as you said, it didn't have to be this way. If only, what if? And those are thoughts, of course, you can't take that back. You can't undo it. And so those are things that I'm sure that they will live with and be working through for a long, long time.
Absolutely. And Andrea, you mentioned the demeanor, the nature of Lori in the courtroom. And that is something that stood out to Charles Vallow's family. And they were asked about it today. Take a listen.
Absurd.
When you heard that mantra over and over again.
And calling Charles, my husband, whom she was hated at the time, whom she was ready to kill him. It's like, that just shows you what she's an actress. She turns on this persona and goes with it, and then boom, she turns it off, and then there's the real her, whatever the real her is. I sure never knew her.
Tell us a little bit, just for me, about Charles. Let's bring it back to him and his legacy.
Hey, you want to take that one?
I'm sorry, what was that?
If you could just tell us a little bit
Charles.
about Charles and his legacy and how you want us to think about him.
He was my big brother, I followed in his footsteps. I did everything he did. He was only a year and 2 months older than me. So we hung around a lot. We had a lot of the same friends. He was a big influence in my life. And he was just a good dude. He was, all the way from a kid till when she killed him. So, yeah.
His big brother, it's, you can see the love, you can feel that, very tender, the way that they speak about him. You heard too, and we didn't include that in that clip, but you heard her we talked about her voice and the way that her demeanor would change, that as she was presenting certain evidence or as she was getting pushback, how she would become very meek. And Kay spoke to that specifically, saying, something about her baby voice, and that was bothersome to them. I mean, that was frustrating. That was annoying. But as you said, I think jurors saw through. I don't think that helped.
No. And after the fact, Kay, I believe she said, you're right. She said, I'm sick of that baby voice. And you could tell that they're over her. They're so over her because they keep having to put up with her case after case after case. And, she said baby voice. And I said, she said when I hope in prison she grows up and starts using, a real voice. So, she's throwing some shade at her. And I would say rightfully so. She just got convicted for killing, for conspiring to kill her brother. Sure. And, I want to point out too, Andrea, that the question that really led into that, those remarks was being, Lori using the term family tragedy instead of,
Right.
murder or anything like that.
Yes.
And I do think, again, we spoke about this earlier in our coverage, but just the difference of, the state laying out this case, that this was a conspiracy, that it was planned, it was premeditated, that they didn't wait to call, or they waited to call 911, that she took Charles's phone after he died. It was just conniving. And then to have Lori say, well, this was just a family tragedy. And, she left it at that. I think it's such a disconnect, and the jury saw through it.
Well, and I think at every point you've heard, I'm the victim. You heard I was being attacked by Charles. This was self-defense. Even in hearing like, what, why, you've treated me as such, the police, like they're proving that I'm a victim in this. And so I think, of course, when we believe that someone is responsible for something and there's no accountability, but instead, almost like an act or an ask for sympathy or an ask for, see, I did nothing wrong, I'm the victim here. I think that does add insult to injury.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, we didn't just see it with this family. I think that's just how she conveys herself. And I spoke with Rachel Smith. She was one of the prosecutors in Idaho leading up to this. And we were talking about, the makeup of the jury and what that might look like and how that might impact this case. And what she told me was that Lori is a manipulator, and she tries to twist people to her advantage. And you saw it, I think, in the way she approached some of her cross-examination. She would maybe come up to some of the investigators and be like, all right, what's your name? I want to make sure I have it right, and kind of be giggly and laughy. And then people she knew, like her other brother who took the stand, and people like Kay, she, would kind of come a little more cold. And we saw these different personalities come through. And it just, I think that's got to be part of it for this jury, that they not only looked at the evidence in this case and were like, okay, there is enough here to find this defendant guilty, but I think her behavior in the courtroom, and then not to mention all the objections we saw from the prosecution and the scolding from the judge, it wasn't a good look for her.
Right. Yeah. And of course, they only said just less than 3 hours. Comparatively, we said we had expected a verdict today simply because the trial it was relatively simple, pretty straightforward, considering just one charge. In the Idaho trial against her, they had multiple charges to consider, and each charge had different layers of that. And so they took a little bit, I think close to 7 hours to deliberate here in those cases. And so it makes sense. I think that plays out less than half of that time to consider the conspiracy charge against her and to find that guilty verdict. So it was, made pretty quick work of all that evidence. Absolutely. And of course we were able to talk to jurors and get a feel for what their experience was like. Did you notice was there a sense of their demeanor as the verdict was read? Did they look at people as they came in? Kind of what was that like today?
What we understand is that the jury came in, what I saw, they just kind of were focused. They were laser focused on what was happening. And, they came in, the foreman said, we have this verdict, and it went forth, and they were all polled after, and they confirmed that, yes, they unanimously got this guilty verdict. But what we heard from Kay Woodcock, again, Charles's sister, is that unfortunately, this isn't her first rodeo. She's been in cases where she's waiting for convictions or, verdicts before. And she said she knows to look at the jurors. And she said it's a good sign maybe if a juror looks at you. And she said she didn't notice that today. So she was like, what could be going on here? And I know Charles's brother said something similar, that, okay, it's going into the afternoon here. We're getting a little worried here that maybe we wouldn't get the result we want from this verdict or from this jury. Right. And ultimately, what Kay said later on, or what she was asked when another reporter asked her, did you notice that some of the jurors looked at you on the way out? And she said, no, I didn't. I was kind of in this, this position of just taking it all in, almost overwhelmed, because this is the moment you're waiting for. So I do think the jury was really moved by her. And it was interesting to see this jury throughout the course of this trial, because they weren't overly expressive, I'll say. There wasn't a lot of, obviously this is an emotional case, but there wasn't a lot of emotional evidence or anyone on the stand that was crying. And we didn't see any, overt reactions like that, but they were certainly an engaged jury and paying attention. And yeah, I think that's where we got that result today. And as you mentioned, Andrea, we did get a chance to speak to some of them. It was interesting because it was a bit of a scene outside the courthouse. Essentially, the verdict was read, and we'll explain a little later, but she essentially stipulated to aggravating factors, she being Lori. So we didn't have to stay for an extra phase there today. And everyone left the courthouse, and there was, a group of media outside. We were waiting to see who's coming out. Of course, we're waiting for family, but then we're waiting for jurors. And because once the jury was released from this case, the judge said, you are allowed to talk about this. You can look this up. And it's obviously their right to speak with us if they want to, and some did agree to speak with us. So it was certainly a big rush once the doors open and we see the jury kind of coming out in a line, and they started dispersing in different directions. So it was just like, all right, let's see if we can get some perspectives here. And a few of them did stop to speak to us. So take a listen.
It's just sad that, this has happened to Charles, and she's given up her life as well. It's sad.
What did you think of her defending herself? Anything that went through the jury's head with that?
Well, for me personally, I thought, what does she have to lose? Guilty or not guilty, what does she have to lose? So
were any of you folks aware that this woman had already been
I had never been heard. I have never heard of her.
Homicides.
Yeah, no,
and
I've never heard of her
did not
before.
Know that.
No, I did not.
And nobody brought it.
Did you? Didn't
ma'am,
know.
would you want to come in and talk too? Do you want to say anything?
What was your experience? There's a lot of backstory here, and this woman had already been convicted of 3 homicides, and they obviously didn't want you folks to know that, and nobody knew that during your deliberations.
No.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Wow.
What was this experience like for you?
It was sad, as he said. For me, it was the text messages that did it, as far as evidence. And I feel like we uncovered some lies.
Her children, she's also been convicted of killing her children.
Yeah.
What went through your mind as you were hearing that?
That's insane. We had no idea, so it was kind of crazy to hear that this wasn't the only case that she's in.
You said that you had a reaction from your grandma. Can you just tell that one more time when you told her that you had been selected for this case?
Yeah. She was like, who's it for? And I told her, and her jaw just dropped. She was like, how do you not know who that is? Like, it's the biggest case in America, basically. So, yeah.
You said that after this, you plan to finally be Googling and watching all of the content that's out there, the documentary?
Yeah, we're about to go watch everything with my family because my mom just flew in. So, I'm about to go watch everything with her and look at everything.
Overall, how would you describe this experience, just in general, being a juror on a high-profile case?
Insane. Considering I only moved here 2 years ago, I never thought I'd be on a jury, let alone one of the biggest cases. So it's been pretty crazy. We've been having to go through back ways so that we're avoided by everyone, so there's no questioning. We've had to go, it's just crazy.
All right, talking about that process to protect those jurors from, any kind of information that might, somebody could say something, somebody could ask a question that would give them insight into something they are not allowed yet to have. But now that they are free, we talked about, we knew that there would be those questions about what else don't we know. And now, as you heard her saying, we're going back, we're going to watch every documentary. We are going to do a deep dive into what we can learn about Lori Vallow Daybell, and it will be interesting to see if some of them continue that discussion or continue to speak out at all after they've been able to understand and hear and learn all about her history.
Absolutely. And you're right, Andrea, because we suspected they must know there's more to this story based on just the way some of the evidence was presented and some of the people that came up during testimony, including Tylee and JJ, Lori's children. I know one of our other reporters here at 12 News in Phoenix was helping to gather some of those jurors gather those interviews, I should say. Sure. And one of them said that she was waiting. She was waiting to hear from Tylee. And that never came. Yeah, obviously, because Tylee is dead. Her mother has been convicted of killing her. But I think there was a lot left out for the jury in this case. And they knew that. Maybe they didn't know exactly why or what, but they knew that there were gaps. And they knew that it wasn't good for Lori Vallow Daybell. So it was really interesting to hear some of those perspectives. And we also heard that none of them knew At least the ones we spoke to said, we didn't know. It was, it might seem wild to think that there are people who didn't know the backstory, but that's the point of having an impartial jury, and they were seated pretty quickly here. So what was your take on hearing some of that, Andrea?
Of course, we are very entrenched in news, and those of us who follow stories, especially, I know true crime is certainly a draw for a lot of people. But outside of that circle, it's easy to understand why, probably be a lot of people who haven't heard from her, especially in Arizona, where it hasn't been quite as high profile, at least in the last little bit. And of course, you just heard, only been here 2 years, so this was well after this entire case started, or this entire investigation. So, interesting to see those people say you had no idea. And of course, that's the right answer, because they wouldn't have been on the jury had they had that backstory or had they had that information. And so now, of course, it also makes them feel better. I would think as a juror, I might feel a little sense of relief. Also, I know we've talked to jurors who say there's always that, that wonder, making sure, did I do the right thing? Of course, they make the decision. Yeah. They're comfortable in that decision. They're confident in that decision. They poll the jury to make sure that everyone agrees that, yes, that is my decision, and I'm comfortable with that. But I believe, again, human nature is to always have a little bit of question of, did I do the right thing? Making sure that I got it right. And so I would imagine that doing some of that research will help them to feel a little bit better about that decision. And you heard that juror talk about, we caught her in some lies. Now she's going to, they're going to have a lot more insight into those lies. Now, this is information that would have come out had Lori not made this decision late today to stipulate to aggravating factors. Let's talk a little bit about that. We will move into a sentencing phase. That's what happens after a conviction. The judge will issue a sentence, but the state had the opportunity to argue for aggravating factors, which simply goes into the sentencing. So it allows the judge to give a stiffer penalty, and it kind of justifies that stiffer penalty. So had Lori not stipulated to this, had the defendant, who is representing herself, wanted to go through this phase, it would have essentially been a new little mini trial. And you heard the prosecutor say that she did have witnesses ready. They weren't ready today, but she was prepared to call those witnesses. And this is where we would have heard things about Lori's previous convictions. Yes. That would have been, very interesting. You heard the juror say, what does she have to lose? I think that's exactly what we saw here in this stipulation. Why? Yeah. What would be the advantage of changing her sentence, even if she could? What would be the advantage? Because she's already sentenced to life sentences in Idaho, will serve the rest of her natural life in prison. And so I would imagine she didn't want to sit through all of that information and new testimony and new evidence, far more damning this time, because it would have brought in all of that past information. What's your take on that? Is that how it seems?
Yeah, no, and I agree, because it didn't seem like she had a leg to stand on. Like, these convictions are real. They happened. And I know she's trying to appeal them in Idaho, but those cases were pretty rock solid, at least from covering them. I know you were inside the courtroom there, and it's hard to believe that she has any fight in the game at this point. And, if we did go into that aggravating phase, the jury would have been part of that. That's what the judge said. Yes. That's what we understand. So they would have been able to find out in real time kind of the magnitude of this case, rather than maybe just being lobbed questions from reporters saying, did you know she's been involved in homicides before? Did you know this? So I hope we can follow up with the jurors more. And, on that point of sentencing, a conviction and bringing this case, it mattered to the prosecutor. It mattered to the victims in this case, the surviving victims in this case, to really bring this forward. Because I know some people say, well, why bother? Because she has life in prison in Idaho. And that conviction matters. I think, it opens the door for victim resources. It closes a door for them, because this has just been blown wide open back in 2019. So I do think it matters. And we understand Lori Vallow Daybell told the judge today that she wants to wait for sentencing until after she's done with her next trial. So as you know, Andrea, we're not done just yet. I know this is another step towards justice for all the people fighting in this case, but there is one more trial here in Arizona.
Yes. And Kay spoke to that. She said, we are not finished just yet. We have one more trial. We need justice for Brandon Boudreaux. Now, of of course, very different in the sense that this is a victim who is still very much alive, but very similar circumstances in that Alex Cox, Lori Vallow Daybell's brother, is the accused triggerman, the one who fired the shot at Brandon Boudreaux, and Lori accused of being his accomplice. And so this will be another conspiracy trial. I would imagine very similar to what we just went through, but it will be a brand new jury. Of course, new evidence, new information. And I think probably if people watching this trial of interest here will be that this will be the information we have probably seen the least of and heard the least about in all of our coverage and all of the discussions, just because it is by nature just kind of the lesser incident, if you will, a little bit less attention.
Yeah.
And so it will be interesting to see what we learned that we haven't heard or seen before.
It is, I think the difference in this case, as you said, Andrea, is that the alleged victim here survived, like he was not injured. He did not die. So I think that he still has his life. So that is there. But I do think these are all interconnected and all, if you really zoom out and look at this, it's all part of the puzzle because it's the same underlying factors in all of this is that Lori and her brother conspired to kill people. And we know that this case with Brandon Boudreaux, this shooting, this stems back from Gilbert, Arizona. So it'll be a different police agency that we will see being called here to the stand, but it's the same prosecutor and the same underbelly in this case with the dark religious beliefs, possibly being possessed. And, it's interesting because there was a name brought up in this trial, and we've heard it before, Melanie. And this is not Lori's friend, Melanie, who has testified in the cases in Idaho, Melanie Gibb. We're talking about her niece, Melanie, because Brandon is her niece's ex-husband. And Melanie was also essentially, it seemed by certain accounts, along for the ride with Lori and her brother, Alex, in part of Chad Daybell's Doomsday religious group. So it's been really interesting to see where she's been in all of this. And we haven't really heard from her. I actually had the opportunity to interview her back in 2020 before Tylee and JJ's bodies were found in Chad Daybell's backyard. And she, at the time, with her new husband, they sat down, talked to me and said, we believe Lori. We have no reason to believe she did any harm to the kids. And she was supportive of her aunt. And, we haven't really seen her since then, and especially after all of this transpired. So I'm wondering if we're going to hear from her in this upcoming case. And, I want to bring it back a little bit too, because some of these dark religious beliefs, like the zombies and people being possessed and light and dark, the first time we as the media learned about some of that was through court records regarding Brandon Boudreaux and Melanie, his, then wife, their records, their divorce records.
Yes.
So it was
divorce
really,
hearings. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. The family court matters. So it was, it was really, really, I would be very curious to hear from her. And I wonder if she will make an appearance in that trial as we prepare for it in just a couple of weeks here.
Yeah, and the question will be whether that would be considered self-incrimination, what kind of access they would have to her. I'm just not sure of all the details in that. If you remember, what's interesting about her is that she did remarry. And if you remember, her current husband was one who helped investigators and I believe wore a wire and listened, and tried to get information. And so that's a dynamic. We've talked before. You need a schematic. You need some sort of diagram to follow all these moving parts. But just also the intertwined, just the complexity of all of these different people. And we heard Brandon's name come up, as you said, Melanie and Brandon. I mean, that was part of this case because we heard, Lori talking about keeping people out of her way, essentially. So she had, access to Charles and the ability to take his life as we understand it in those messages. And so you're right, we will certainly probably hear some of this, even more of the complexity and even more of the interconnectedness, if you will. And then also, what Brandon has to say, not only about that initial, or the case that we're talking about, this charge, but how much of his backstory and how much of these religious beliefs and the other things that impacted his life related to those, how much that'll be entered into evidence or into testimony will remain to be seen.
Absolutely. And I'll point out too, Andrea, that Brandon was there today as the verdict was read. It seems that, I know he's been very much out of the spotlight. I do not blame him, but it seems like he and Kay Woodcock have formed a bond. We talked about, these people who have been impacted by these crimes really kind of coming together. And I think that's one of the relationships that's been forged through all this trauma and all this horror and all this heartbreak. And, you know, we've seen him in Idaho. We know he testified in, you know, some of those cases. So we've heard from him before, but we've never really heard, you know, maybe what he would want to share outside of a courtroom. So we're hoping to see, you know, we're hoping to maybe learn more about him. But speaking of courtroom, speaking of juries, I do want to bring it back a moment, Andrea, to the jury in this current case, because what I learned from our, you know, team out talking to the reporters today is that they entered, you know, they entered deliberations, some of them thinking this was a not guilty case. So maybe that's surprising to you. Yeah, it was interesting for me to hear that too, because what I understand, according, you know, to my colleague, is that they said, yeah, we thought this was maybe not guilty, but we had an adult conversation in that deliberation room, and this is where we got to. So I think, you know, people were wondering, could this be a slam dunk case? Is it clear and dry? You know, as the time ticked on today, we're like, okay, it's getting close to 3 hours. We're getting here. So I think that does raise some, okay, did the state do its job? Did, you know, it brings in a lot of questions of what the jury was thinking. And it sounds like they were, you know, really dutiful in carrying out, you know, what they needed to do to get to a unanimous verdict. So I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Well, it'll be interesting. I would love to, as we said, you know, of course, I want to ask, I have 100 questions and I'd like to ask all of them. But, you know, to understand, was that hesitation saying this is really serious and so I want to be sure? Was there something, I would be interested to know if there's something that stood out to them as raising that doubt? You know, was there one piece of information or was there one piece of the investigation or maybe even what Lori said about what was lacking in the investigation? You know, what was that thing, I think, that caused hesitation? Because I think us watching it, and of course, again, we're coming at this from a lot more insight, but we're looking at those text messages, much like what that juror that we heard from said. You know, I think that was the biggest piece for me, is these text messages. I don't know how you make sense of those otherwise. And so it would be interesting, very interesting, to hear what that hesitation was and, you know, what exactly was sitting in their mind that made them question or not be, you know, adamant that it was a guilty verdict going in there initially. And so maybe they went back through that evidence and, you know, talked about that. And that's what this, you know, that's really what jury deliberation is all about. It is intended to bring 12 different perspectives, very unique perspectives that have not been shared through the course of this trial, bring them together and see if they can find consensus based on everything that they have seen, everything they've heard, and then also those instructions. You know, the judge and the court is very clear about what you can consider, how you should consider it, what you cannot consider. You know, even if you think you know something, unless it was presented at trial, that simply isn't supposed to be a part of your deliberation. And so the responsibility on them, the ask on a juror, is tremendous.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And we've talked about this before. And like I said, I hope we get the opportunity to talk with more jurors or revisit with some other jurors, is that I want to bring it to Tom. He was an alternate juror in Lori Vallow's trial in Idaho. And I know you guys have spoken with him before. He sat in for a lot of the testimony here in Arizona. He's written books, and it just feels like his life completely changed after serving on the jury there.
Yeah, he's written books. He's written one about the Lori Vallow Daybell trial. He was an alternate juror. He talks a lot about that, and now he's working on one about the Chad Daybell trial. And so you're right, this seems to have sort of taken on, his life has taken on kind of a new path based on that experience. And you heard the jurors said, I had no idea I'd ever be on a jury. And wow, you know, such a tremendous one. And I would imagine it is an impact that, lifelong impact. Certainly will be stories to tell. And of course, I would imagine it'll be interesting to see if any of them are at Brandon's trial, if they, you know, want to follow the case as Tom has as a juror, if, you know, he has moved forward and continued to cover these cases as they've happened. It'll be interesting to see if we see any of them in the gallery interested in what is happening in that case, just wanting to know more and wanting to learn more. We've found that, you know, as Lori Vallow Daybell, more of her history comes out, people get very interested. And I think that's part of what you hear from Charles Vallow's family, JJ Tiley's family, certainly Colby Ryan, her oldest son, still living. I think there is an effort to shift attention away from her. And I think that's exactly what we heard from Kay today, saying, can we, you know, I look forward to the day we don't have to have a conversation about her anymore. And I
Yeah,
would
and
imagine
I
that's
mean-
what she's waiting for, this next trial to be over so that it can be finally finished.
Finally time to move on. And I'll bring this up, Andrea. I've been waiting to show you. This is different than the bracelet I showed you maybe last week from when we were on Inside the Courtroom. But this is an updated bracelet. It says Justice for Tylee. I'll try to hold it up and see if you can see Justice for Tylee, JJ, Charles, and Tammy. So,
Interesting. Okay.
It's really, these were being passed outside after the verdict today. A lot of people wearing them already. And I do think that speaks to just the significance of, how big this case is, the magnitude, as we say, all the people who have been touched by this. But I also think it speaks to just the community that is formed to try and support these victims' families. And there really is this effort as we go case by case by case here. Of course, there's a fascination and a lot of wonder around, well, how could someone kill their kids? How could someone be involved in something so horrific? So I do think there's attention for those reasons. And of course, Vallow Daybell representing herself is a spectacle in and of itself. But I do think there's a real effort, and I think there's a lot of people who are interested to understand the victims and remember them in a way that isn't in this vein anymore. And, Andrea, as we talked about, a lot of this unfolded, originally in Idaho. So I'm wondering if you got any reaction up your way today, what you heard from the community there.
Yeah, we know that people have been watching. We've heard, they are certainly their eyes wanting, glued to the TV, glued internet, waiting for that verdict. I think that because we have seen these guilty verdicts before, I think people felt very confident that this would be a guilty verdict. I didn't get any sense from comments that we saw or information that we got, people asking about the verdict. I didn't get any sense that this was a surprise. I think, again, probably just relief. Since ultimately people saying they got it right. From everything that they know and they believe, they got it right. Do we know if Lori, you talked about Lori representing herself, do we know if she's going to represent herself again in the Brandon Boudreaux trial, the conspiracy to commit murder there? We believe she is, right? Is that the information so far? Okay.
That's the information so far. She plans to. And it's been interesting because she's been interesting in court, hearing, some of these proceedings leading up to this trial. And, she did not want to waive her right to a speedy trial, including this upcoming trial. So the original date was actually scheduled to maybe start, or the last final day was set to start during, the time frame that was allotted for this trial. And the judge was like, we can't do two at the same time. You need to understand this. But her mentality has been really interesting in that it seems like she just wants to speed through these, but also take it to court, for lack of a better term. So we're expecting her to represent herself, although I'm wondering if the outcome of this trial may change her mind. And, we don't know that. We don't know that. So we hope to learn that in the coming days. And as for that next trial, what we're expecting, my understanding is that they're going to start sending out jury questionnaires for that case to try and, solicit the jury pool there at the end of May. And then the trial is set to start in the beginning of June. And it's allotted, to wrap up at the latest early July. So we have another possibly month there where we'll be in trial. But again, this one went pretty quickly. So comparative to the 4 to 6 weeks they set aside for it.
Yeah, right. And I'd imagine, you have to assume that with this trial being so close to that one, I would guess that it might be even more difficult to find a jury who hasn't heard about her, since we will have had so much coverage in this short period of time, in that local area. So it'll be interesting to see if they have a harder time being able to find jurors who are not already knowledgeable about her, haven't heard her name, don't know anything about her previous convictions. That might be more difficult to find.
Yeah. And, we've also been talking, wondering, do we think we're going to see the crowds? Do we think people will show up for this trial in the way we've seen people show up in Idaho and seen people show up in this case, people getting out before the sun rises to wait in line to get into the courthouse? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think there will be a lot of attention on this case too?
I think you heard Kay say, I'm going to be there. I feel like they're going to be people very connected to this case who are going to want to see it through, and connected to the case, meaning, wanting to make sure that there's justice for every single one of the victims in these trials. And yet I also think that I would guess that public, expression of that interest will probably drop. I would think just because it is not quite as salacious, it is not quite as well known. I think based on those factors alone, I would expect to see fewer people in the courtroom to watch. But I would bet that we will also see some of those key players very interested and very connected throughout.
Absolutely. And once that second trial wraps up, however it may, Vallow Daybell will be sent back to Idaho once she's sentenced here. She won't be serving any of her time here in Arizona because, again, she has those 3 life sentences in Idaho. She'll be extradited back, and that is where she'll be for the rest of her natural life.
Yes. She serving her time in the prison, the women's facility in Pocatello, Idaho. I had an opportunity to tour that facility a few months ago to see exactly where she lives and what that facility looks like. And so, yes, she will be on her way back, but not before one more trial. It is another conspiracy trial. And as you said, Erica, you will be there. You will be inside the courtroom. We will keep that, keep you updated on that. We will bring you all of that coverage, and then the final sentencing for both of these cases. So Lori Vallow Daybell won a guilty verdict today. We will wait to see what happens in that next conspiracy trial, and then the same judge in that case, also hearing the next conspiracy trial. So it's going to be one to watch, and we're glad you're going to be with us for that, Erica. And we will take you inside the courtroom.